Okay, thank you. So hello again. I'm glad to see you all and looking forward to the digital reading of Ray Acheson's book, Banning the Bomb, Smashing the Patriarchy, tonight. And yeah, Helen and I did the organization together, but however, many people are contributing tonight to make it a successful event. So now I'm going to introduce you to our guests. First of all, our awesome guest, Ray Acheson. Ray used the pronouns they, them, their, and Ray is currently director of the disarmament program Reaching Critical Will at Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in New York City. And together with Ray, we will take a look at the international challenges around nuclear disarmament and disarmament in general. This event will be moderated by Leonie Wanner. She uses the pronouns she, her. And Leonie is a current intern at WILPF International Secretariat in Geneva and member of the youth delegation to the NPT RevCon. This event is organized by 3 German organizations, and it's the Netzwerk Friedenskooperative, Friedenswerkstatt Mutlang, and the Women's Network for Peace, and I will briefly introduce you to the organizations. The Women's Network for Peace has been working for peace and equal participation of women in peace activities in politics and society since 1996 and is based in Bonn. The Friedenswerkstatt Mutlang is located at the historic site of the peace movement and former location of nuclear weapons. The Friedenswerkstatt Mutlang served the peace movement as a focal point for its on-site actions and was acquired by the Mutlang Peace and Meeting Center Association in 1984. And the Netzwerk Friedenskooperative is an organization within the peace movement and campaigns for more peaceful and just world. The network emerged in 1989 from the coordinating committee of the peace movement. Today, it supports campaigns as well as actions and is the publisher of the magazine Friedensforum. The Friedenskooperative is also based in Bonn. Me, as a former intern of Netzwerk Friedenskooperative, I'm really happy to have organized this event together with Helen, and now I pass on to her. She is also an intern at Pressehütte Mutlang and is going to explain some rules to you.
Yeah, thank you, Emma, for the brief introduction. My part of today's evening is to friendly remind you to some common rules for our setting. So first, please stay muted whilst the discussion and exchange between Leonie and Ray is going on. We also invite you to turn on your videos, your cameras, to better connect with each other. But as the meeting is recorded, we totally accept if you prefer to leave your cameras turned off. Second, for those who did not read the first message in the chat yet, we ask you to write your pronouns in your Zoom name to ensure not to misgender anyone. And third, there will be a longer question and answer session at the end of the reading, so please save your upcoming questions until then. If you want to ask something at that point of the program, use the Zoom function to raise your hand that you can find in the bottom screen section under the icon reactions, or alternatively, you can write your question in the chat once we reach that stage. We will be endeavored to answer as many questions as possible and encourage you to take this unique opportunity to be virtually in one room with Ray. And with these words, I want to thank everyone for your patience and finally give the floor to Leonie. Thank you.
Hello from my side, and thank you all for coming. And most of all, I thank Ray for being here and discussing this issue with us in the current situation. The Russian aggression against Ukraine shocks all of us. And in the light of this aggression, the German government wants to spend an additional 100 billion euros on equipping the Bundeswehr, the German armed forces. So we will discuss what this means for nuclear policy later, and you'll also have the chance to ask questions about it. But first, I will give a brief introduction about TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and feminist perspectives on nuclear policy, as is the fundament of the book, before we take a closer look at the book. After that, I will go into exchange with Ray, and then we will start the Q&A session. So let's get started. Our time frame is very tight, so yeah. This year marked the first anniversary of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, short TPNW. More than a year ago, on the 22nd January 2021, the treaty advanced the development, testing, production, transfer, and so on of nuclear weapons, entered into force and became international law. Since its adoption in 2017, 86 states signed and 59 states ratified the treaty, and it's also the first treaty to recognize the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons on women and indigenous people. But why is this important? Through a feminist lens, nuclear weapons symbolize a militarized masculinity that associates weapon with power. This system maintains and legitimizes the privileges of those who possess nuclear weapons and manifests itself in the principle of nuclear deterrence. That system equates security with weapons. This association is highly gendered. Women and other marginalized groups are considered weak, and arguments against nuclear weapons and their humanitarian effects are declared as naive. Even though the impact of nuclear weapons, their production and testing disproportionately affect women and indigenous people. This book, Bending the Bomb, Smashing the Patriarchy, tells us about those experiences, but also about so much more. It's a story about how people came together across experiences, across identities, to make the impossible happen, to change power in the status quo. It's a story about the efforts of activists like us, queer, feminist, indigenous, anti-racist environment activists, and them taking risks. The book shows why the international security architecture keeps most people insecure, and how, through activism, we can create a progressive international law and a world order that works for all. For me, the book is important for all those who advocate against these weapons of mass destruction, like all of us. It gives hope that change is possible. And I learned a lot, even though I thought I already knew a lot. So read the book. And I learned, I quote, "Nuclear weapons are powerful because we treat them as powerful." And I find this very empowering. And to give you a first impression of the book, I will read a passage from the acknowledgement section that was very encouraging and inspiring for me, and I hope it's for you too. So, I don't know if you see it, but my book, it looks very used, and it's used, so yeah. Let me start. This book, like the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons or the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, is not a perfect thing. But like the treaty and the campaign, it's an honest attempt to give something useful to the world. It's my hope that this book provides insights and hope to activists, diplomats, academics, and others who want to work together with other people to make stuff happen. At the end of the day, that is really the best we can do. Sometimes it works, a lot of time it doesn't work. And sometimes it feels like we fail spectacularly. But we never really fail if we try. doing the work against the odds and defiance of the naysayers, despite our own shortcomings, striving to improve ourselves and the world around us. This, in my opinion, is what makes life worth living. Yeah. After this empowering passage, I will now go into the exchange with Ray. We will talk about the rhetoric of nuclear armed states and the activism for the ban. And Ray will also give us an assessment of the current developments and what the future of nuclear weapons may look like. Nuclear weapons, arms control, and armament are, as we all know, challenging issues. And as activists, it's very difficult to successfully resist and work against the rhetoric of nuclear armed states. Starting with a basic question, Ray, why did you start working on this topic? Why did you write the book, and what's your message?
Thanks a lot, Leonie, and thank you to everybody for organizing this event. And I apologize for not speaking German today, but I hope that everyone can follow along. I started working on nuclear weapons because I really saw this issue as being at the core of so many of the other social justice efforts I was involved in from the time I was a teenager, which, you know, was anti-war activism, but also anti-prison activism. And I really saw how nuclear weapons were kind of, as a symbol, one of the leading edges of oppression, violence, dominance, patriarchy, racism in the world, and how everything that underpins the existence of nuclear weapons, why they were first made, why they still exist, why billions of dollars are poured into these weapons while we're living in a world in crisis. Everything that underpins that is also the same forces that are at play at all the other social justice and environmental issues that any of us might be engaged in. And so from that perspective, the work to get the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is a much bigger part of the overall struggle in the world for peace, for justice, and for designing and constructing a world that works for more people. And so I've never seen it as just an issue of nuclear weapons or just this particular treaty or just work that's going on in the United Nations. I really do see it as just a small part of a much larger puzzle. And so that's why I wrote the book. I tried to connect it up to these other issues. I tried to bring in the feminist perspective, the queer perspective, the anti-racist perspective in organizing that has gone into anti-nuclear work since the beginning, and really trying to provide a framework that is counter to the dominant narrative that we're always fed by those who have the platforms, get the TV interviews, you know, get academic postings tied to think tanks, which are in turn tied to many nuclear weapon contractors, etc. Their dominant narrative is it's a very different language. It's a language about geostability and techno-strategic discourse and mutually assured destruction. And, you know, it's like the world is a chessboard and they're moving their pieces around, and nuclear weapons are a tool that they have to bump pieces off the board or control other nations. And we're seeing that play out right now very well in real time. And so this book and the broader efforts to ban nuclear weapons are really about confronting not just nuclear weapons as objects, but this whole discourse around them, the philosophy of them, and taking some power away from that, which we can see is so instrumental in making progress on any other social issue as well.
Thank you for this great answer. I think a lot of us really feel this. And Speaking of some countries controlling other nations, the NPT is viewed as a great disarmament treaty, but it allows certain countries, surprisingly the most powerful countries in the world, to possess nuclear weapons. Would you say that the NPT is rather a treaty to maintain the status quo than a disarmament treaty, a treaty that actively encourages nuclear armed states to possess more rather than hinders nuclear disarmament?
At this point in time, yes, the Non-Proliferation Treaty has been misused by the nuclear armed states to perpetuate their possession of nuclear weapons. Of course, that's not how the treaty was intended, which actually came through work by the government of Ireland in a resolution in the General Assembly to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons, but also to provide an instrument that would obligate the nuclear armed states to disarm, which is written into the treaty. Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty is legally binding on the 5 nuclear armed states that are party to it to eliminate their nuclear arsenals. And they have not complied with that provision. But as we see in so much of the way that international law and the P5 interact with each other within that legal space, is that they have acted with what they see as impunity. They even see the treaty as justifying their possession of nuclear weapons because there's, written into the treaty, it describes them as nuclear weapon states, as if that's a category of state that is permitted to exist in the world, which was never the intention. And so that framework for achieving disarmament now has become very, very challenging for all the governments that want to achieve nuclear abolition, for all of us activists and organizers that are pushing for this, because it's a corrupted framework. And so that's part of the reason why we pursued the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which doesn't have this tiered category of states, which very clearly says that everyone is equal before the law, and the law is that nuclear weapons are illegal.
Yeah, and that countries have misused the NPT is also, as you just said, the reason why so many countries fought for the ban. Why is there such a difference in the way governments view nuclear weapons?
Only 9 countries have nuclear weapons, and I think that's always a really important place to start. And of course, then there are some US allies within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, as well as Japan, South Korea, and Australia that include US nuclear weapons in their security doctrines. But we're really talking about a minority of states in the world. Of course, they're among the biggest in the global economy. These are also the states that produce and export the most weapons, that are involved in the most wars. And so we can see a pretty systematic mapping of where these countries stand in general when it comes to the use of force to settle conflicts or to get their way. And nuclear weapons are part of the sort of buy-in to the militarist approach to the world order. Whereas most of the world's governments see nuclear weapons as a threat, not just to them, and that nuclear weapons could be used against them as countries, but to the entire world, because a detonation of a single nuclear bomb anywhere is not going to respect borders. It is going to have impacts globally. And a nuclear exchange, of course, will threaten the survival of the entire planet. And so in that sense, their view of nuclear weapons is that these are existential threats for everybody that's alive on our planet, for all of the plants, animals, water, air, soil, everything that keeps us alive on this planet. And so their attitude is these weapons are not legitimate for any state or actor to have. They must be completely eliminated. And that is part of a bigger puzzle, of course, of broader disarmament, but that one of the things that has to happen now is for these weapons to be eliminated. And we're seeing that in a lot of the statements coming out at the General Assembly today, where many countries, and this week, many countries saying, and the Secretary General saying, there's never a legitimate excuse for the use of nuclear weapons. So the fact that a lot of countries are saying that, including countries that don't support the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, is really interesting to us as organizers, and will be something that we'll try to leverage moving forward, of course. That the instinctual reaction in a moment of crisis is, these are terrible weapons, we have to get rid of them. And so we need to certainly build on that moving forward, that instinct of abhorrence.
Yeah, thank you. And I think the reason for that is also that those countries who possess nuclear weapons often don't experience the consequences that come with uranium mining or testing and so on. You write in your book that nuclear supportive states reflect the position of nuclear armed states. Do you think that if the relationship between, for example, Germany and the US is shaken as it was under Trump, this would have consequences for the nuclear sharing agreement? So do you think that nuclear sharing would have ended if Trump had won the election?
I don't know about that, and I don't want to really envision a world in which he won the election again. But I think what is interesting is the ways in which we were seeing some cracks within NATO around this question. So we had Norway and Germany both committing to attend the first meeting of states parties of the TPNW. Whenever that was going to be held, it was supposed to be March, then, it'll be later this year. And so that's happened within the last few months, these commitments from NATO states to come to this meeting and to engage with TPNW states parties. We've seen, of course, opposition consistently from both activists and organizers, but also parliamentarians and political parties in opposition to the government that do support an end to nuclear sharing, that do support an end to Germany and other NATO states relying on nuclear weapons in their security doctrine, and would like to move away from this. So I think that's one of the things that I've also tried to convey with the book, is that states themselves are not monolithic blocks. And so there are always people we can talk to, movements that we can engage with within countries, within governments that do want to see change and are up against a lot of opposition internally to do so. But it's our job as organizers, as activists, as thinkers and writers and doers, to crack those open as much as possible. Now, of course, with what's unfolding, there's a lot of concern from the anti-nuclear community that this will re-solidify NATO in a moment that it desperately needs to be cracked open even further. And so again, it's our job in this moment not to be overcome with despair at the likelihood that NATO will double down on itself and double down on militarism, as Germany has just announced with its with all of its new funding that you mentioned earlier, but to really push back against that and to keep elevating the voices for peace, for disarmament, for, whilst not, of course, excusing anything that Russia's done, to also highlight the role that NATO has played in coming to this crisis and making sure that we're talking about both of those issues. As we're talking about militarism, we're talking about war, and all of these forces are in favor of that, and nuclear weapons on all sides of this issue. NATO's nuclear weapons, the US nuclear weapons, France and the UK nuclear weapons, plus Russia's nuclear weapons, they're all problematic.
Yeah, I think right now is a very hard and difficult time for us to really advocate for the ban and so on, given this situation we're in right now. But it's also the moment we need to do it. And yeah, that's the weird position activists are in. but we see that it leads to success. So 7 years of effort and 7 decades of anti-nuclear activism finally led to the ban of nuclear weapons. Can you summarize your experience of fighting for the ban in a few sentences? Looking back, what was it like?
It was pushing for any kind of change. Obviously, there's a lot of frustration and backsliding and woeful despair. But I think what I really want to highlight is also how much joy it can bring to your life as a person. Those were super intense years, building up a sense of community with diplomats from governments that really wanted to make a difference, and activists from around the world, some of whom worked on this issue their entire lives, 50, 60, 70 years, others who were brand new to the issue and really wanted to get involved to end nuclear weapons. And so it was really a diverse campaign to work on. So those connections that we built with people, the community of trust that we built up with diplomats to move forward on this, under the pressure of the most quote unquote powerful, measured in military might, countries in the world who were opposing them at the highest levels of government, trying to shut this down. There is an element of passion to this work that should not go overlooked, because it's easy to get caught up in all the frustrations. I mean, it looks like the treaty was negotiated very quickly. It took place within 1 year, over a few weeks, really. But it took about 7 years of concerted action to get to that point. And a lot of frustrating moments in that time. But overall, it was an experience, I think, that has given me a lot of hope about what's possible when people do come together to act for something.
Yeah, I think backsliding, frustration, joy, and hope are our everyday vocabulary as activists. So yeah, do you have some strategies you would like to share with us so that we as activists don't lose hope?
The main thing is community. We can't do this alone, and no single one of us is going to be responsible for the end of nuclear weapons. We're building on the legacy of all those who have come before us, and we're trying to build something for all those who will come after us, to keep doing this work. And I think that the most important thing really to sustain ourselves in this work is to have other people that we're connected with, so that when we're having the days of despair, someone else can take the lead or talk us off the cliff. And we can do that for others when they're having those moments of despair. And the feeling of camaraderie, comradeship is so important, I think, to be able to keep coming back to this work, especially in these dark times when we see exactly the direction the world is moving in. It's everything that we've warned about, and we're ridiculed for even discussing or worrying about. And it's easy to want to throw up your hands and give up. But I think that it's really the community that we built that will keep us in this action. And I think the other thing that's been really important for me over many years is recognizing the ways in which the work that others are doing has meaning for the work that I'm doing, and vice versa. So whether that's learning from other people's analysis or strategy on movements to abolish war or police or prisons or capitalism, and remembering that we're all tied together, that feeling that can sometimes come of Should I work on nuclear weapons? Should I work on the climate crisis? Should I work on police brutality? Should I work on, migrant rights issues? What should I be doing? If you can, find something that you can do that you're passionate about with people that you love, do that, because you're helping all of the other things too, and you can learn from what everyone else is doing. And that sense of solidarity, I think, is probably the most important in this moment and any moment.
Yeah, I also think community and solidarity is key. And maybe I think some of people in the audience are from the peace movement in Germany. So maybe they can share their experiences later with community and solidarity and how that affected their work. Speaking of this, there has been decades of activism, like here in Germany, for the ban. Since when do you think a ban has been in the offing? What were the key events, points? I mean, you described them in your book, but I think not all of us have read your book yet. Maybe after the reading.
There were, I guess, in terms of the UN process, there's some key moments, of course, where we managed to move things along. This actually, in 2010 was when we first had, at the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, actually, some language in the outcome about the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, which came from a push from Switzerland, Norway, others like Austria, Mexico, Ireland backing them up, pushing to get that recognition in. Once we had that, it was actually Norway that took it and hosted a conference in 2013 in Oslo that brought together countries to talk about the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. So that was a key moment. At that point, in public, it wasn't about the ban, but at this point, a lot of governments were strategizing with each other and with ICANN and other activists about how to use this as the sort of launching point for a process to ban nuclear weapons. And many of these same diplomats, or at least others within those government systems, had been involved in banning landmines, banning cluster bombs. And so they sort of wanted to do the same thing with nuclear weapons and follow this trajectory from looking at the facts about nuclear weapons to their prohibition and their stigmatization in order to compel their elimination. And so those are some key moments. It's hard in a talk like this to go into the UN weeds and talk about key points, but I mean, there was some great moments in 2016, I guess, at the UN, both in Geneva and New York, where the opposition of the nuclear allied states and the nuclear armed states actually helped propel countries in favor of the ban because of, in particular, their arrogance towards these countries, saying that the countries that were championing a ban on nuclear weapons didn't know what they were talking about, had no real security interests in the world to worry about. There was incredible racialized, gendered language being deployed, saying that these governments were irrational, they were being emotional, and all of that. And some of the maneuverings that went in to apply pressure within the UN system backfired and really moved a lot of countries that were on the fence over firmly into the let's ban nuclear weapons camp. So all of that is described in the book. So yeah, I hope you pick it up and have a look at it. Some of it's pretty funny, make a lot of jokes at the Australian delegation's expense. So yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I really recommend reading the book. It's very empowering in the first passage, and then you think, what the fuck is going on? And then it's funny, and then it's empowering again. So yeah, now we have the ban. Regarding the future of nuclear weapons, you point out in your book that the TPNW has and will continue to have a normative impact on the behavior of other countries. whether they join or not, how long do you think nuclear armed states can and will resist and fight back?
I don't like to predict things, and I always say that on webinars and in talks, and I feel like that is justified, especially given what we're seeing now. I mean, we just don't know what's going to happen and what the responses to current events, future events might be. In this moment, the nuclear armed states will oppose nuclear disarmament for as long as they possibly can. But at what moment will that become completely untenable for them? I mean, this current crisis could go in either direction, right? This could be a moment in which they invest heavily into modernization, which they've already invested billions and plan to spend trillions more. So I don't know how much more they can double down on that. But the US is undertaking its nuclear posture review right now, and it's paused that to see what happens with this crisis. And of course, it could become even worse than it's ever been. But there's also the possibility that with this reaction to the threat of nuclear weapons being visible to people again, in a way that it hasn't been for many ordinary folks around the world for so long, that this could actually embolden the movement against nuclear weapons, that it could actually help us to push beyond this crisis and conflict for more concerted action for nuclear abolition in a really meaningful way. It could bring more people into our movements. It could mean, more parliamentarians joining the parliamentary pledge in support of the TPNW, more cities joining the ICANN Cities Appeal, more banks and pension funds divesting from nuclear weapons. We've already seen so much of that happening, including in the nuclear armed states, where financial institutions are saying, no, nuclear weapons are illegal now, so we're pulling our money out. That's already happening. In this moment, that could happen even more. And so I think we need to always be looking for those openings, not to be opportunists in a crisis, of course, but to really be looking at the ways in which we can try and make the world safer coming out of this and moving through this, since we're still in such the early days of it, and not to just assume that everything is going to get worse, but to try and push back against that.
Yes, it just said the ban could change international legal, political, social, economic environment, that a ban would affect financial investment, that it would make it more difficult for nuclear states to justify the possession of nuclear weapons. So what has exactly been achieved right now?
So we've seen hundreds of cities around the world, including in nuclear armed states and NATO states, come on support for the treaty, including through public debates in city councils and legislation. In New York City, we have on the call Kathleen Sullivan, who helped lead the work in New York City to get legislation there, to have the city not just support the TPNW, but also commit to divesting all of New York City's pension funds from nuclear weapon producers. So a lot of that work is happening already. We're already seeing opposition from parliamentarians in many countries building up to support the TPNW, saying that they'll commit to work within their governments. We're seeing this really having an effect when governments change. And so we saw that in Norway, we saw it in Germany, we're seeing it in other places around the world, that if a country has a government that doesn't support the treaty today, it might have one that supports it tomorrow. So by doing that work now, by getting those parliamentarians from opposition parties on board now, we've laid the groundwork and they're already committed once they come to power. So that is really essential work that's coming on board. We're also just seeing, I think, a tangible shift in the way nuclear weapons are talked about more broadly. I have seen so much more consideration of the racial justice impacts of this issue than I have ever before, where people in the US and in many other places are looking at what the impacts, as you said, of uranium mining have been, what the impacts of nuclear testing have been on Indigenous territories. And I think that discourse, that dialogue, and people with lived experience are really, their voices have been amplified since the ban treaty process, and have been legitimized. Credibility is changing. The idea of who can speak on issues is changing. Of course, that's all part of the broader social movement against patriarchy, against racism in our world. And so we, I believe, are both benefiting from that wider change and also contributing to that wider change, and being, again, part of the bigger movement. Oh, and divestment, that's the other, I had already said a few things, but that's the other big practical thing that's happening, is we've seen so much money already being taken away from nuclear weapon producers, and not just from countries that are joining the treaty, but from those that currently oppose the treaty. Still, their government pension funds or private financial institutions are saying no. So that's a lot of work that people can get involved in. You can do it on a personal level to move your own money from a bank or to question your bank, but you can also work to get big financial institutions to divest as well. And it's worked. We see the impact this has with cluster bombs and landmines. We see the impact it's having with fossil fuels. And so it's really important to do that work.
All these achievements, they're great. But now we find ourselves in a devastating situation. We find ourselves backsliding. And in Germany, the years of work and advocacy of German peace organizations, of many German peace organizations, seem to have been set back by years. As I said, the German government wants, among other things, spend an additional 100 billion euros on equipping the Bundeswehr, given the Russian attack against Ukraine. Why does this violation, the Russian aggression against Ukraine, for the national law makes the discussion about nuclear weapons even more relevant?
Well, there's the immediate ways in which, Putin's decision to put Russian nuclear forces on a special alert status, higher alert status. There's the threat that poses, of course, that signals a potential willingness to use nuclear weapons. And he did indicate even earlier when he launched the attack that he threatened to use nuclear weapons against anyone who intervened. He didn't say nuclear weapons, but we all knew what he meant. And so that sort of immediate threat, I think, raises the nuclear issue for all of us. But I also think that the ways in which that really shows the fantasy of nuclear deterrence, right? Because the whole argument for nuclear weapons by the establishment that possesses them or believes in them is that these weapons will prevent an attack, especially an attack on countries with nuclear weapons. So if that were true, why is NATO concerned that Russia will attack it with nuclear weapons in this moment? Because they know that it's a fallacy. So, I think it helps us in this moment to really be unpacking these myths, challenging these narratives about how nuclear weapons are for security, when what we can very clearly see, what every person in the world can see, is that nuclear weapons have made this situation so much worse and so much more dangerous. And so I think that that's one important element that we need to hold to. But beyond just Russia's nuclear weapons in this situation, we also have to be drawing attention to the fact that 3 NATO members possess nuclear weapons themselves. 5 NATO members have nuclear weapons, US nuclear weapons on their soil. That this is, this isn't just a threat by Russia. This is a threat by every country that possesses these weapons anywhere in the world, or that includes these weapons in their security doctrines. And so making sure that we're always raising that broader issue, I think is also really important. And then finally, just, you know, I've already said this, so I don't want to repeat myself too much, but for the despair that German peace activists and anti-nuclear activists are feeling, it's totally valid to feel despair. I'm right there with you, but I also think that this is the moment when we have to stick to what it is that we've been advocating for all these years. If we were correct yesterday, then we're still correct today. This situation actually exposes how corrupt this entire system of alleged international security based on militarism is. And so we need to be continuing to say that. And I know there's so much pressure to say that the only way to support the people of Ukraine in this moment is to send more weapons or to impose a no-fly zone. What that will lead to is more death and more destruction. And so we need to be, as hard as it is and as much pressure as there is for us to stop advocating for peace, I really think that we do need to continue elevating the voices of peace, the voices of people who have lived experience of living through war, and can speak exactly to what happens when countries become awash with weapons, what happens if nuclear weapons are used, and what the effects of that are, such as in Japan. You know, we need to really be continuing, as much as they want to double down on their militarism, we have to double down on our peace. This is not a time to compromise the voices for peace.
Yeah, very important words in this situation. I think we're all in this, I don't know, thinking, and is it right? Is it wrong? You know. Thank you for your great answers. We will now hear a passage from you, Ray. Yeah, Ray, the floor is yours.
Okay, I think I might just read the last paragraph of the book, if that's okay. I feel like I've talked a lot. And since this is such a moment of despair, I want to end again with hope. In case you didn't get it, the top line message of this webinar is have hope. And I'm just going to double down on that now. The willingness and tenacity to keep trying to create change despite the obstacles is where hope lies and where change is achieved. Giving in to the powerful is not an option, for it is only in giving up that we fail. The act of prohibiting nuclear weapons is an act of nonviolent, positive, courageous revolt. It is transformative. It is long fought and hard won, and it is certainly not over. It is a piece of the path of a long road of activism, sacrifice, and courage from people the world over for decades. It is an important piece, a critical node, and it will require more courage from governments and from activists to carry forward successfully. As Ireland's foreign minister said in 2010, quoting Irish poet Edmund Burke, "Never despair, but if you do, work on in despair." You never know when change might happen, but the only way it will ever happen is if you keep working for it.
Thank you for this great, empowering, inspiring, whatever passage. Now it's time for you all to ask questions. Please raise your hand and then we'll ask you to unmute yourself.
No one's talking, but I just saw Mia clap. Thanks, Mia. Mia and I worked together for years at RCW, so thank you for all of that. And it's good to see your name, if not your face.
I can't believe that nobody has any questions. Yes, please.
Hello, thank you for this meeting. Also, I have only one question. nuclear weapons treaty is signed by all the countries all over the world, but Israel no. I have on Twitter asked Dr. Muhammad al-Baradi, was director of the nuclear agency. It's my luck to have an Egyptian doctor in this position. He told me I have no answer for this question. Why Israel don't sign this treaty? And they have also this nuclear weapon.
Yes, none of the nuclear armed states have so far joined the treaty, and none of the NATO countries either have joined it at this point. So that is where a lot of our efforts are. There is a really great organization that is led by an Israeli and an Iranian called the Middle East Treaty Organization, and they are working regionally to promote the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but also to work for a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. So I will find that link and pop it in the chat for you now.
Okay.
Thanks for this question and the answer. Now we have Friedensmuseum to ask a question, so please unmute yourself.
Hello, my name is Wolfgang Nick from the Peace Museum. I want to describe a little bit in more detail the problem we are having in Germany right now. I think if we go back half a year or more, a majority of the people here said, oh, the nuclear weapons of both sides are bad. They are really comparable. It doesn't matter the Russian nukes or the American ones, everything is bad, and that's why we want to get rid of them. And in the situation now, we have a lot of demonstrations and manifestations, but very often they say, we are against the war, we need more weapons, we are against that war, we have to push the Russians back. And in these situations, the problem of the German nuclear sharing gets a very different meaning, because many people really say the Russian nukes, this is the ones that are aimed at us, and good luck that we have the Americans, so hopefully they are able to deter the Russian ones. So there is a really, I would say, a kind of revival. And if you try on such manifestations, you say the way that Putin speaks really tells how desperate he is because he cannot control the situation. Then the people say, no, you are pro-Russia, that is not allowed, and we have to do something, we need more weapons, we need a better army, we need nuclear weapons. I hear this on the street. Is this a solution? Certainly not, but it's a reality, I feel.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been told in the last few weeks that I'm either pro-Russian or pro-US NATO from people reading the same thing that I'm writing. You know, it's like people are really, I mean, people are afraid in this moment, right? And so they latch on to what they think is a credible narrative. And that's why all the work that we do over time to build up alternative credible narratives is so important. And that's why I really do think that the voice for peace needs to be our go-to, needs to be our consistent go-to. But yeah, it is really hard. It is really hard to have people telling us this is why we need nuclear weapons, when it's clear that no, this is exactly why we don't need nuclear weapons. And I mean, as anti-war, as anti-nuclear activists, for us, it's like, how does your brain go there? But we know that the brain goes there because that's what's being fed. That's what's been fed. It's a comforting narrative. The same thing just in general with the militarization and the idea, you know, Germany's, the German foreign minister. Oh, I have a echo. The German foreign minister's speech at the UN General Assembly yesterday. I don't know if any of you watched that. It was high rhetorics, like really, really theatrical in the way that she presented Germany's change in position and decision to invest 100 billion euros into its military, of like, we've heard you, that we've abandoned our important role in the international security scene. And it's just like, no, all of us on the activist side, you know, on the peace movement side, have the exact opposite reaction to that. And so these narratives for violence are really still dominant. And so that's why people do go to them and see it as, well, now this is our only option. And so it's more important than ever that we are trying to give as much credibility and amplification to the voices speaking for peace, including from within Ukraine and Russia, as well as everywhere else that is currently in conflict. Other countries are right now being bombed by the US and Russia and Saudi Arabia. And, you know, it's like, we need to elevating that voice against war everywhere, not just this war, is just so critical right now.
Yeah, very important. Kathleen, I don't know if I pronounced your name correctly, but yes, you can correct me. Okay.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Ray, for this brilliant talk. Any of you that are following Ray on her blog, do sign up for Reaching Critical Will. The blog yesterday, brilliant. I just want to have you talk a little bit about the importance of the focus in the treaty on threat of use. You've already said a little bit about that, but that was hard won, and it's certainly very important in today's climate. Can you say a little more about that, Ray?
Yes, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons outlaws threat of use of nuclear weapons, along with use and everything else that was described earlier. And so that was hard won, like Kathleen says. That was actually not all the countries participating in negotiations supported that, which was really interesting. I do go into it in the book of the different positions that government took on that issue, and many others. So sort of the last two chapters of the book are for people who care about the details. It's a bit nerdy, but I wanted to provide a record of it, at least a record from my perspective. There are probably other interpretations of what happened, but yeah, that was one of the fights that we had, or disagreements that we had within the negotiations. And the value of it being there is so important for what we're seeing in this moment. And it really comes out of the International Court of Justice in 1996, having an advisory opinion on the use and threat of use of nuclear weapons. And it didn't really settle the question. And so it was vitally important that we settled that question once and for all, because it's another thing that the nuclear armed states have kind of hid behind for many years, that there was this, caveat about existential threat. And so we're saying, no, it's never lawful to threaten to use nuclear weapons. And this is fully consistent also with the UN Charter, which is one of the arguments that I think won the day, because the UN Charter outlaws not just the use of force, but also the threat of the use of force. And so bringing the nuclear governance into line with the UN Charter on that point was so imperative. And it's something that's been in the context of the General Assembly discussion the last few days. That element of the Charter has been what's brought the majority of countries to support this resolution in this moment that's condemning the Russian aggression, because it's a violation of the Charter. And I think some of the most profound comments about this have come from smaller states, small island states, and others who say, we don't have militaries, we don't have nuclear weapons. I think Trinidad and Tobago said, our shield is the UN Charter. That is how we defend ourselves. The UN Charter is existential to us, and must be defended and upheld. And so that's the attitude that threat of use of nuclear weapons tries to convey as well.
Anyone else? We can also, if you're not comfortable in asking the question in English, we can try to translate it. Also für alle die es nicht auf Englisch die Frage stellen wollen, wir können auch versuchen, es einfach kurz auf Englisch zu übersetzen. Otherwise, I have a lot of other questions, so I can just jump in again. So it's about the narrative and looking at Germany. When we as activists talk to German parliamentarians and argue for banning and ending nuclear weapons, I would say most common answer is that we cannot end nuclear sharing in Germany because of the Russian aggression. And it was before the war started, and because before the war started now, I mean, the war is going on since 8 years, but yeah, the real attack, the physical attack now.
Yeah, so I think, you know, the pushback to nuclear sharing is the same as it is to nuclear weapons in general, right? So it's this diametrically opposed view that we talked about earlier when we were talking about why most countries in the world oppose nuclear weapons. It's because they don't keep us safe. They don't deter war. We're seeing that right now very clearly, that they don't deter war. They don't deter threats against other nuclear armed states. If they're used, they will be catastrophic. Even without being used in war, they cause all kinds of devastation around the world in terms of their, you know, uranium mining, production of nuclear weapons, testing of nuclear weapons, maintenance of nuclear weapons. They're costing billions of dollars, which is taking away from the ability of governments to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis, poverty, inequality, etc. Name any issue, nuclear weapons are taking money away from it. So I think those are all the arguments. But what it comes down to is, again, this gut reaction people have of feeling like they cling to that narrative of, oh, this will keep us safe. It won't keep us safe. It's never kept us safe. And it's not going to keep us safe in the future. I think that's what we have to keep coming back to. And then we can spell out again and again, reiterating for people the harms they've already caused, the harms they cause every day in various manifestations. But it's really pushing back on this idea, which has been, you know, really drilled into people's minds, that nuclear weapons are for security. And we need to flip that narrative, because, and that was the entire ban process was built on flipping that narrative, that nuclear weapons bring security and stability to the world. In this moment, we can see that they do not. And yet people still go to the narrative because they want to believe, because, you know, denial's really important for sheltering our brains from the shock of what might happen. And we don't want that. We don't want to scare people into not being able to do anything. But I think that it's just super important to always turn that argument on its head when people want to revert to violence as a way to prevent violence or deter violence. It does not work. And it continues to be demonstrated that it will not work. I mean, I think that's the thing with the militarism as well that I really try and talk about, not nuclear specific, but just in general. It's like the world is spending $2 trillion a year on militarism. The United States spends over $750 billion a year on militarism. This is where most of the money goes. This is where most of the human ingenuity goes. I mean, you look at tech development, the development now of autonomous weapons and cyber warfare, and, you know, that we're just pouring everything we have into this track of militarization, of violence, of war. And the only thing it has brought us is more violence and more war. So when people then say we need more of that in order to confront it, it's completely absurd. But it's the framework that so many people are invested in because it's what the news says, it's what they hear from political leaders, it's what's taken as the legitimate approach. But it makes absolutely no sense if you really stop to think about it. And so I think that work that we can do within our own families, communities, friends groups, even peace groups who now in this moment are like throwing away principles, some of them, and saying, oh, well, now we have to support Ukrainians by sending them weapons. Put on the brakes. Let's talk about this. Let's look at why do we think that another 100 billion euros for the German military is going to solve any of this? How is it not just going to result in more of the same again and again and again and again? And meanwhile, our planet is literally on fire or flooding. And that's the reality. This militarization as a solution to anything is a fantasy. We have to keep bringing it back to the reality of what the majority of people on this planet are living through and experiencing right now.
The ban opposes this patriarchal and racist techniques and rhetoric. It represents a revolt of the majority of states against this violence, intimidation, injustice, and so on. Is the TPNW, would you say that the TPNW is an anti-colonial movement?
Yeah, I think that what was really interesting for me in particular was not just that the activists saw it as such, but that diplomats saw it as such as well. They really, especially once all of the racist opposition came out towards their countries, that they just didn't know what they were talking about or were being irrational, and that, you know, let's let the big countries of the world solve this problem, you know, little pats on the head. That sort of that attitude towards many of them really, I think, helped solidify this as an anti-colonial process and movement. And, you know, there's the whole history of the non-aligned movement, which is now more difficult because some non-aligned movement members have nuclear weapons. But putting that question aside, there is this history of different ways that and different arrangements that countries in the global South have always rejected nuclear weapons, including through nuclear weapon-free zone treaties and organizing cross-regionally to oppose nuclear weapons. And so this, for many of them, was also a continuation of that legacy. You know, they're pulling up statements and positions from their governments that had been made 40 years ago of standing very proudly against nuclear weapons in this or that forum. And so for a lot of the government actors working on this process, it was a point of pride and for them to be part of this and to be part of this history through this process.
Emma?
You already mentioned it a little bit, but can you say what do you think the new developments in the war in Ukraine mean now for us as peace activists? So what's our task now? And maybe you can also say what it means for you personally. I totally share your view, but I wonder if the war in Ukraine will lead to nuclear weapons being seen more critically because the threat is now more actual in some way, or as you also already said, will countries be more likely to think about also acquiring nuclear weapons because they are in fear?
I don't see this as a big moment for a proliferation risk, no. I think that the global norm against nuclear weapon possession is quite strong. I could be wrong, I don't know everything, but I'm not seeing or feeling that right now. That's not the vibe I'm getting from you know, interactions with UN delegates or anything else. Of course, anything is possible. But I think from the government side, in terms of that, there's definitely more, we're seeing more outspoken critique against nuclear weapons from governments that support nuclear weapons in this moment. So I think that's what, that's what I was trying to say earlier, was it makes it really essential for us to latch onto that and to push forward for that. So every country in the UN General Assembly that said nuclear weapons, there's no justification to ever use nuclear weapons, or, something to that effect, which many of them have said, including NATO states, we need to be working within those countries, with the anti-nuclear movements and organizers within those countries, to make sure that we're holding those governments to account, that this isn't just about Russia's nuclear weapons, this is about all nuclear weapons. If you're saying there's never a justification for use, and we're watching the spectacular fail of deterrence, which we already knew was a failure, but I mean, it's now, we can make that case more loudly amongst people who don't necessarily work on these issues. This is the moment to really unpack our government's positions on nuclear weapons. And so, one of my governments, Ireland, is already on board, but Canada was very supportive of, or saying language that was very anti-nuclear yesterday. It's like, really, Canada? Okay, I'm gonna take that up with you after this meeting. Thanks. So I think we need to be doing that as much as possible. And just, again, what I said earlier about being consistent voices for peace against all the opposition, including amongst peace groups, to stay peaceful, I think is really important. And I totally recognize how hard that is in this moment.
So we also have something in the chat. I read it out loud. Maybe it would be a credible argument if we propose to use those 100 billion euros for the climate. I think that's a great suggestion.
I totally agree. The IPCC just put out its report saying that our time frame for being able to have a livable future is like this. So now's the time. That would be the most credible response from any government, would be to say, stop war, stop violence, stop militarism. Let's all just invest in dealing with this catastrophe.
Yeah, totally. Marvin, you have a question?
Yes, I heard about there was a referendum in Belarus the last days over the question whether there should be deployed Russian nuclear weapons. Do you have any information on this?
Yeah, so this was a referendum that was called a while ago. It wasn't a reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it's something that actually within ICANN we've been working with the Belarusian opposition leader, who's in exile right now, and so she and Beatrice Finn met maybe a month ago now to talk about this, the call to change the Belarusian constitution and to oppose that. And so now we've seen that action take place within the timing of this conflict, which is really not good. And so, yeah, that's something that, is another thing that Belarusian activists, in this moment, it's very hard to pay attention to anything else other than the war, but is definitely, in terms of the long-term effects that has too, in moving away from peace and disarmament and towards more nuclearization of the world, is extremely unfortunate. And of course, the justification from Russia and Belarus for that is NATO stationing nuclear weapons on its soil. And so without the thing about like the whataboutism, right? We can never let one side's violence justify another side's violence. So we always have to be careful about that. But when we're talking about this referendum on the Constitution, we need to also be talking about we need to get rid of all nuclear weapons. This can't just be about Russian nuclear weapons or Belarus hosting nuclear weapons. It also has to be about US nuclear weapons and NATO countries hosting US nuclear weapons. They all need to go.
Yeah, totally. They need to go. And speaking of the ban, what is potential impact on the political economy? We haven't talked about, we have a bit, but yeah, looking at the financial impact, is the TPNW also anti-capitalist?
As the treaty itself, no, it doesn't weigh in on that. But you know, members of ICANN are anti-capitalist, and so definitely propel that narrative forward for sure. But I don't think that the governments that have signed on to the TPNW would necessarily agree with that narrative. But I think that it's for me, in terms of mobilizing and educating on the treaty and the value of the treaty, that framework for me in the spaces that I operate and the types of activists that I'm trying to talk to about the treaty, that's a very valuable framing and approach to take in terms of the ways in which the capitalist system is so firmly embedded in the nuclear weapon industry, particularly in the United States, but also in the other nuclear armed states as well, in terms of the private corporations that are making profits from this, the political leaders that have nuclear weapon factories in their districts, and the lobbyists that are always, you know, at Congress pushing for nuclear policies that embolden their profits rather than actually protect people. So all of that is intimately, of course, bound up in the capitalist system, and more broadly than that, in terms of its global impacts and things that we've talked about in terms of the effects that it's had on in terms of military spending, but also the physical impacts and how that is, you know, that being bound up in the colonial capitalist extractivist system as well. So these are the types of things that I say, not the types of things that are necessarily embedded in the treaty itself, but that I think are very useful ways for us to talk about why this treaty is important in opposing nuclear weapons.
And we also see now that the armament companies are massively profiting from the war. So yeah, that's horribly and crazy. And we also have a question in the chat. I think it's a follow-up question to Marvin's question. So the referendum in Belarus is inconsistency to the NPT.
Yes. So yeah, it is. I think it can very easily be read as a violation of the NPT. What's going to be interesting, I think, whenever the next NPT review conference is held, is the extent to which that argument gets play, because of course the NATO countries have been arguing for years that their nuclear sharing is not a violation of the NPT. So how they're going to call Belarus's hosting of nuclear weapons, if they do indeed host, how they're going to square that circle, that'll be fun to watch and ridicule as that happens and unfolds. But you know, and one of their arguments is about historical legacy and, oh, these weapons were there at a certain time and blah, 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 and whatever arguments and justifications they come up with. But basically all of it is in violation of the NPT, as is the continued possession of nuclear weapons. I mean, everything that the nuclear armed and nuclear supportive states are doing is in violation of the NPT.
I think it's about the power, who can really violate the NPT and who doesn't. And I think that's the whole narrative. We have now time for one last question. If anybody wants to ask the last question. I think that's too much pressure.
My voice is giving out anyway.
Friedensmuseum, do you want to? No, just waving, okay. Yeah, I think then that's it. And thank you all for asking these great questions. And thank you, Ray, for your time, your expertise, your great answers, and especially your book. I think it's a great book and everybody should read it. And as you're as enthusiastic, I can't pronounce just word, but you know what I mean, about the book as me, Helen has now shared the link and you can also purchase it if you'd like. Also, Ray will publish a book in July named Abolishing State Violence, A World Beyond Bombs, Borders and Cages. Stay tuned, so I will definitely buy this book as well. And I'm closing this reading now with the following words from the book. I quote, "The only way to ensure that they are never used again is to eliminate them." And with this, I'm closing the reading. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Ray, again, and have a nice day, evening, whatever, wherever you are.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today.
Thank you for being here, and yeah, take care, all of us.